Welcome back, everyone. I am Cas Piancey. I'm joined as usual by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing well. How are you, Cas?
I'm doing great. We have a special guest today, Sean Tuffy, regulatory consultant specialist. How are you, Sean?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
It's awesome to have you on. We've really only done one full episode about the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we more or less said the title is provocative. The title is "Fuck the SEC." All my friends hate the SEC, but in reality, our argument was that they're caught between a rock and a hard place. That either they're regulating too much and everyone hates them, or they're not regulating at all and everyone hates them. But today we're going to talk about the idea of merging the SEC and the CFTC, Commodities Futures Trading Commission. They were established significantly later than the SEC. Can you talk about the difference between the SEC and the CFTC?
Yeah, sure. So I think you're right. Everyone tends to think of, because most of the financial regulation in the U.S. happened in the 30s into the early 40s. And so everyone tends to think that's when everything was created. But the CFTC doesn't come along into the early to mid 70s. And so the CFTC does, separate from the SEC, is it regulates sort of commodities and futures trading, which in its original origin is all agriculture based. So that's sort of really the CFTC's origin story. Whereas the SEC does, all securities markets, secondary markets that we know and love, stocks, exchanges, mutual funds, asset managers, and all that. Whereas CFTC was originally much more narrowly defined concerning commodities.
Why, to start off with I guess maybe a simpleton question here, why would it take 40 years later for a regulatory agency to start looking into these markets? From the SEC being established to look to regulate secondary markets, and then the CFTC being established 40 years later to look at these more physical based agriculture markets. Like why wouldn't it almost is like counterintuitive. Like why wouldn't the CFTC be established much earlier than the SEC?
Right. So I guess that's a little misleading on my part. So there was a regulatory agency ahead of the CFTC. So it was the CEA. Looked after commodities. And so why the CFTC came in the late 60s, essentially as the original CEA that overlooked commodities. So there's CEA, the Act, and then the Commodities Exchange Administration. So there's the Act, well, CEA, very confusing. So the Act sort of designated that the agency overlooked commodities. And part of the thing was that they only could look over what was enumerated in the text. So every time a new futures or commodity came online, they had to amend the Act to add potatoes, to add, or in this case, not add onions, to add any sort of new commodity to the Act to allow the CEA to oversee it. And so that became tiresome. And then at the same time, as we move into the 60s, early 70s, financialization, as we know and love it, starts to really be born. And so there's a feeling that futures in general need to be regulated, not specifically just commodities futures. And so they decide, they being the powers that be, the Congress decides we need to sort of step up our regulation of commodities futures trading, because it is now moving beyond, commodities have been around forever. They've been traded, for in the US since the mid 1800s, globally traded much longer than that. But in their original sort of intention, the people trading them were essentially producers or users, because essentially hedging, farmers were trying to hedge their crops or lock in prices. Many, bakers were trying to lock in flour. It was essentially a fiscally based real economy hedging tool. And as you got to financialization, it stopped being that for a lot of people and started becoming much more sort of trading and speculatively orientated. And so the feeling was that the CEA was not up to the task, and you needed sort of a more robust regulatory agency with more broadly defined powers. So one of the things when the CFTC comes in is, rather than Congress having to say, you now need to regulate this, it can regulate all futures trading, which is how we run into it in fun stuff like the election contracts, right? So that's how the CFTC claimed jurisdiction over election contracts, because those are options and futures. So that's in their broad remit. We can discuss how that's not how it should be in the later as we chat, but that's how it came to be. So there was a regulatory agency. The decision was that as it became more sort of Wall Street orientated, that you needed a more robust regulator. And so in the 70s, they moved forward to create the CFTC. And so that's for the origin. Now, how it's fun that there was a move when it started not to have it be on its own. So if you read Robin Wigglesworth's book, Trillions, the CFTC was originally proposed just to be part of the SEC.
So I think that's a good transition point to kind of get into how common is it globally, historically, whatever, to kind of separate out the regulation of like securities product from these commodities-based financial products. Like, is that typical for other countries? And like you were talking about, it almost didn't happen here either.
Right. Yeah. So it's very odd, I guess is the best way to put it. So the U.S., like, this is one of those things, you live in the U.S., you kind of accept you live in any country, you accept the way things are done as normal. But the U.S. is really an outlier here, with the most notable other exception being, America's neighbors to the north, Canada, which has an even crazier setup and has no federal securities oversight, and it's all done at the provincial level. So that's an even more chaotic attempt. So the U.S. and Canada are the only two sort of regulated countries globally that don't have a single securities and market regulator. That would have all, futures, stocks, everything under one regulatory roof. And then, like you said, it almost didn't, that was almost the route the U.S. went. And if you read the book, Rob Wigglesworth's book, the anecdote is that the SEC essentially was snobby and they didn't want to be regulating pork futures and pork bellies. And so they said that stuff is for farmers, not for Wall Street. We don't want to be regulating it. And they sort of pushed back against the idea that it should be under the SEC's remit, and sort of path dependency becomes what it is, and it's spun out, and we are where we are today.
Are there any obvious benefits and drawbacks that arise from this division?
Champions of the division would argue, essentially, if you look at all of America's regulatory landscape, it's fractured everywhere. And so there's a belief that having competing regulatory, I don't believe this, but there is an argument that having competing regulatory agencies keeps them honest and allows for competition. I mean, that's the best I can do. The other argument is that commodities is a specialized oversight and are distinct, but that makes less and less sense as we get to, Dodd-Frank putting swaps into the CFTC's remit and some other things. So those are the two arguments. There aren't really strong arguments for it beyond that's the way it's always been done. The arguments against it, I think, are pretty self-evident, but it's that you don't have where we are today, where new people can look for crevices between the two agencies and try to sort of pick them off, and you don't have overlapping or conflicting jurisdictions. But in the case of obviously this podcast and the crypto, you don't really have an industry that can play mom against dad, essentially. And so, like, having a single regulator, is preferable for efficiency, for oversight, for sort of market sanity, especially when you look at how it works now that, the CFTC approves futures, but then the SEC has to approve their trading. Like, it gets very messy around the edges. So, like, the argument against it is that it purely is not efficient and not a good way to run a railroad.
What you got at there illustrates why the division between the SEC and the CFTC has become so important for cryptocurrency, in that it is trying to pit them against each other, choose regulations from one or the other, trying to effectively remain in a gray zone for kind of both of them, or to limit its overall regulatory footprint by specifically lobbying for certain pieces of policy that would explicitly put it in a certain thing, using advertisements and political giving to target certain regulators, using the mouthpieces of certain crypto firms to specifically criticize certain regulators and things like that. And so looking at that, from crypto, it really seems like that division makes it harder to have consistent frameworks for financial products. And that just seems like the obvious consequence of all that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we talk about the CFTC, and so we talked about its origin, and it was a largely, I would say, in the nicest way possible, a very sleepy regulator for its first 30 years. It was, not in a bad way. It had its market, it regulated it effectively. Then you get to the late 90s, and the name escapes me, but the chair at the time in 98 pushes that the CFTC should regulate swaps and derivatives. These are new instruments that are being have been created by Wall Street that sort of, it's actually slightly analogous to crypto, and they're new and they're not, but derivatives come up, swaps come up, and these are new financial instruments that aren't explicitly mentioned anywhere in legislative text. And the CFTC says we should be able to regulate these OTC derivatives. Like these are essentially not that much functionally different than futures and options. Like, why wouldn't we? They release a paper, all hell breaks loose, they get pushed back. Congress says explicitly you can't do that. Chair quits, long-term capital management blows up. 10 years later, financial crisis happens. I'm giving the Cliff Notes version. And so then after the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank comes in and they give the CFTC OTC derivative oversight that they'd asked for essentially a decade earlier. And sort of this makes the CFTC a much more consequential regulator because it is now really like, it interacted with Wall Street on futures and options, but now it's really sort of in the meat of the debate. And so that's when it became a much more consequential regulator for Wall Street, for the industry. And then flash forward to the mid 2010s, as you guys surely know, and I'm sure your listeners do, why it's in the crypto conversation is because the CFTC became much more, I would say, crypto curious than the SEC, and Bitcoin became designated a commodity. Whether we could argue whether that's right or not, I think everyone has their opinions on that, but that's essentially, and they actually went a step further and said all crypto are commodities. Commodities are what? No one's yet to explain, but that's how the CFTC, I would say, interjected itself and became the first regulator to move to regulate crypto. Now, you can argue, and some have, that is a better attempt than the SEC just sitting back and watching it unfold and not doing anything till the early 2020s. But that's a sort of essentially how the CFTC became into conflict with the SEC. And this goes back to the problem with the setup. One hand declares it a commodity. Even if the SEC disagrees, it's very hard once they've made the statement to disagree, unless you're going to sue your fellow regulator and set up a really terrible public policy fight. So that's where you end up in a bad place. And that's sort of how we ended up with the CFTC becoming in the conversation. And now sort of, I would say it's fair, the CFTC is the preferred regulator of the crypto industry.
So I actually want to jump into that for a second, because you're talking about the CFTC and the SEC kind of like they're on, in a sense, like equal footing, that the CFTC is taking on all these new markets and has been for several decades now. And that, I mean, these are pretty large and growing markets, I would say. But when you look at the SEC budget and you look at the CFTC budget, one of them is 7 times bigger than the other one.
Oh, yeah.
And I would also, I haven't looked at the employee numbers, but I assume that the SEC has significantly more employees than the CFTC. So I wonder if the reason that the preferred regulator is the CFTC is mostly because they understand that the CFTC's abilities are really hamstrung.
Yeah, I mean, we can all I would assume that is part of it. What the hell? Like, I don't see any point in not dancing around this. I would assume the CFTC is viewed as an easier regulator and a lighter touch regulator. And I'm trying to be fair here because I'm not a huge fan of the SEC either. So I think for years, my career, at least since the financial crisis, has been tracking and, really following financial regulation. And for years, the CFTC had in fin reg circles, a stronger reputation than the SEC in terms of promulgating the rules it needed to and focusing on the issues that it was supposed to, and being essentially a less political organization. Like the SEC, the last 10, 15 years, has become highly, highly more politicized. So I think the CFTC is good at certain elements what they do, but the expansion sort of into crypto, into the election betting, sort of moves it beyond its comfort zone. And I think you are right. Compared, the two aren't funded on equal footing at all. The CFTC is well below. And that's because, and I think this is an important point as you talk about sort of who regulates what. The CFTC is an industry regulator, not a retail regulator. So that's a really important distinction. And I think it's important when we think about who regulates crypto or how that gets done in the future. The CFTC has essentially no expertise in investor level protection regulation. Like they are a markets regulator, they are an industry regulator. They make sure, the markets function appropriately, but they don't have retail investor protection expertise. And as you look at sort of the two examples I brought up, the general crypto in the widest sense and the election betting, those are far more retail orientated. So I think that becomes, to me, one of the biggest challenges, which could all be washed away to just put these two organizations together, is by having, when you have an organization that's all of a sudden looking after retail and investor level protection that has no tradition of that, it's challenging.
Well, and I think even Rostin Benham, who leads the CFTC, has said in like some of the cryptocurrency focused hearings that like the CFTC would need a change to its funding if Congress is interested in expanding its mandate, because like we've talked about here, they are the less resourced of these two regulators. Yeah.
And that's why like now I've been, for those who follow me on social or whatever, like I have been ranting about merging the CFTC and SEC. I tilted that windmill for like over a decade. And I will say like it comes up not all the time, frequently in conversation. So post GFC with Dodd-Frank was being drafted.
Didn't Paulson bring this up in like 2009 or something like that?
Yeah, it did come up, and it was my feeling is if it didn't happen then, it's hard for me to see it ever happening. But so after the GFC, there was a very legitimate push that these two orgs need to be put together, but institutional resistance sort of stopped it. And so now, when you think about why it doesn't happen, path dependency, and then if you're cynical, the Senate Agriculture Committee really likes Wall Street donations. I mean, they have different congressional oversight. And so the Senate Ag Committee oversees the CFTC, and I'm not the only one to suggest this. So, I mean, I think that there's a feeling that they rather enjoy the attention and lobbying money they get from Wall Street that comes with overseeing the CFTC.
I will say, as like a reporter, as someone who covers this, it's a little bit hilarious to me that like half the crypto hearings and stuff I have to listen in on are agricultural committee meetings. They're talking about how best to regulate Bitcoin. In the same hearing, they're talking about corn. That feels ridiculous.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I mean, it's a weird place we're in now, and I think. I mean, who knows what happens with crypto regulation in the U.S. If it should spark, why are we doing this separate? Because any of the bills you've seen so far, from the bad faith ones, the good faith ones, have this weird split where they still need both agencies to do pieces. And it's just who's riding shotgun and who's in the driver's seat when it comes to it. But they still need both agencies. And it's just still a really weird setup. And I mean, it doesn't do industry any good to have to deal with multiple regulators. I'll put it that way. So most people in the industry would prefer to deal with a single regulator than two.
Are there parts of the industry that benefit from having two regulators besides cryptocurrency, which we kind of talked about, which benefits from like pitting them against each other? Outside of that, are there people who benefit from having two?
So, I mean, generally speaking, I would say no. I mean, I would say so if you look at let's leave crypto, which will, I know your readers and listeners are crypto people, but or anti-crypto, they're crypto adjacent, but put that aside for a moment and just go back to futures and options. So obviously most buy-side firms, most banks deal with futures options, and they deal with sort of securities. And so those more, I would say, established regulated industries, beyond plain occasionally coming up with a new instrument, trying to get it on one side of the fence or the other, don't really benefit from having two regulatory agencies. And I think if you were to ask, investment bankers, if you were to ask, bank trading trading floors, asset managers, what their preference would be, they would prefer one over two, because it's ultimately, especially as, stuff like swaps and derivatives, which is really what bring these into conflict and the TradFi, having to have multiple reporting to different agencies is, on the real back office stuff, is a nightmare. And so it would be easier to have one set of rules to navigate.
You mentioned that if the merge didn't happen during the Great Financial Crisis, it's never going to happen kind of feeling that you have. But I'm curious, just because I'm reflecting on the Silicon Valley Bank situation, and I definitely, Bennett and I have done some reporting on on the banking sector and how it's regulated, which is also totally broken and weird.
OCC, FDIC, Federal Reserve,
exactly.
And, state level regulators.
Yeah.
And state level regulators, exactly.
Yeah.
And then when something does happen, they always end up blaming each other. And saying like, well, you know, the Federal Reserve was supposed to be looking out for this. And then they're like, well, no, the OCC was supposed to be, you know, it's everybody pointing fingers at each other. And so they all get off the hook because they say like, well, it wasn't my responsibility. And then ultimately like the banks and like, I don't know, as far as I know, there's no criminal charges in regard to Silicon Valley Bank. Like nobody has gotten in trouble about like, right. So it's like these massive failures can happen. Everybody points fingers at everyone else. And then ultimately, like, no one faces responsibility. So while I hear what you're saying, where you're like, oh, investment bankers might want this, I look at everyone else and I'm like, they don't want it, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair. And like, I mean, I think banking is far more broken than securities regulation in the U.S. And I think a lot of it, like I heard it somewhere, a lot of it comes down to sort of the Federalist versus anti-Federalist breakdown in the U.S. And that sort of most of the U.S. regulatory oversight on almost everything was largely state level forever. And so what you have is, so the SEC created in 1933 or 34, 33 and 34, two acts, is the first federal securities law. You know, prior to that, securities law is all a state level thing. So, and all of these agencies are trying to sort of stitch together federal oversight where legal tradition doesn't have it. But you're right that, you know, we don't, you know, when you look at SVB, I will say, I paid a reasonable amount of attention. I actually don't think there was any criminality. I just think there was a ton of stupidity running through SVB from the customer base. And, you know, misrunning your hedges isn't criminal. It's just dumb. And then having a few $1 billion in a checking account isn't criminal. It's just ridiculous. Like, so I don't think criminal, you know, there might have been banking regulations versus criminality, I think it's a tough thing to try to get sort of park that. But I think your point, but I will say, when these things do break down, and they always do, you are 100% right. In the banking world, they all point at each other and nothing gets fixed. And the banking world's another place where you should really rewire things. And in fairness, the thrift supervision guys got shut down after the GFC. So we didn't lose one banking regulator, which is, I guess, something. But the reason I say we don't see it, one thing that I think, you know, many people might know, you look at what happened in the US post GFC versus the UK, Ireland, and Europe, is they did a lot more root and branch on regulatory oversight than the US. So the US sort of, you know, got rid of the Office of Thrift Supervision, and that was essentially it, and papered over the cracks and said we're fine. You know, the UK buried the old FSA, started the FCA, put prudential regulation, and then, you know, created PRA. Europe essentially created 3, now 4 European level regulators. So there was a much more acknowledgement of framework failure, regulatory failure outside the US than inside the US. And so, but an event that almost brings the world to a halt and brings, you know, sets us up for a decade of low growth, doesn't say, why do we have 2 securities regulators? I find it hard to believe we're ever going to get to the place where they merge. You're just going to always have this place where I'm posting dumb memes and jokes until I'm 80, demanding these demanding these things get merged, but they probably never do. I mean, I guess if I'm being my more honest moments.
So, I mean, is that part of the takeaway kind of for the United States here? Like, real structural reform of regulators seems unlikely to happen in the foreseeable future. If we were unable to pull it together after the great financial crisis, it seems unlikely to ever happen.
I mean, the event that would trigger real root and branch reform is so horrible. I definitely don't want to see it. So, like, I think I think you will see tinkering around the edges, and you probably end up seeing, you're more likely to see a regulatory agency created than you are to see one merged or destroyed, which is, you know, like, honestly, you could say, and I think they're doing good work, but this
CFPB
is, you know, and I did argue, and I sort of changed my tune on this a little bit. That could have been created as a division of any number of the existing regulators already. Like, it did it. Now, it's fine that it's standalone. I don't want to relitigate, you know, that to the end of days, but like, there's a world where you just say, maybe that's the SEC's job too, or the banking's job too. But, hey, you know, you're not, like, it's hard. It's easier to set up a new regulator than it is to rationalize existing regulators. And the other takeaway I think is important, this is something that, again, America's tradition of, and we're in that period now, when you look at what the Supreme Court's saying around what is federally allowed and what's a state's prerogative, is unique in a lot of ways to the American experience. So we don't, that isn't something that, like, as you have, when they tore down the FSA in the UK and set up the FCA and the PRA, you didn't have like the county saying, no, we should be doing that. People accept federal oversight of securities markets much in banking everywhere else without much of a second thought, and so we're talking about the federal level, but you have like arguably one of the most powerful regulators in the US is the NYFDS, New York Department of Financial Services. And that's a state level regulator that has, because of, Wall Street being in Manhattan, has an unprecedented global reach. And it's essentially a state regulator run out of, Albany. Like it's just a very weird situation.
I wonder with the incoming administration, if you think, not that I'm asking you to predict this, but I do, but I am curious if, you're talking about the likelihood of a merge of these being near zero and maybe more regulators coming into place. But I wonder if we're going to see more erosion of the ability to regulate from the SEC and CFTC, federal regulators. And I don't know if our viewers and listeners are familiar with blue sky laws, but blue sky laws were far more commonplace before the SEC was established. And they're basically it was like anti-fraud legislation, but it was done state by state. So you just had to like do things in a different state and mail things and do there were just weird loopholes that allowed people to get away with all kinds of crazy financial shenanigans. But I wonder if that's more along the lines of what you expect us to see, like an erosion of federal regulation and a cropping up of these state regulators being far more important.
I mean, certainly, the Chevron decision, striking of Chevron last year, and a couple of other Supreme Court decisions make it, and this is really interesting, and make it basically impossible for a regulator to promulgate new rules unless it's explicitly laid out in their mandate. So the idea, the battle cry of the crypto industry the last 2 years, which has been the SEC is doing regulation by enforcement. They should just give us new rules. They now can't give new rules. So like honestly, so even if Trump appoints a pro crypto SEC chair and they produce guidance or rules on crypto, a well-financed anti-crypto lobby is going to sue them because they don't have the right under post Chevron to do that. So for any meaningful crypto legislation is going to have to come to the legislator. And I don't see that happening soon. So I think what you will see, I think you're right that federal regulators between a Republican, the Trump administration and the Supreme Court are greatly constrained in what they can do for regulation, which leads to two outcomes. The first is actually regulation by enforcement. I'm using air quotes now, becomes more prominent because they can't do regulation by regulation anymore. All they can do now, the focus of said enforcement might diminish or change targets, but that's all they can do. They can't produce new rules unless it's explicitly in their remit, which brings us to the states. And I think what actually happens at the state level is, I mentioned the NYFDS, they become much more important, but not in a like Texas could say stock exchanges and doing whatever they want kind of way, in a Spitzer kind of way and cracking down on research. So, if you're going to remember that, like, Spitzer, he rose to fame because the SEC at the time stepped back from something. And the state, ambitious state AGs stepped in to pursue investor protection regulation. So I think what you're going to end up with, probably for crypto, but probably for a lot of stuff, is AGs at state level regulators in California, New York, to a lesser degree Massachusetts, because it's to a lesser degree, these states pursuing aggressive cases. And so I think, be careful what you wish for, but like state level regulation is only good if they're on your side. Otherwise, you'd have to fight. It's sort of like, would you rather fight one regulator or 50 regulators, right? So it becomes a lot more challenging. So I think you will see a lot more action at the state level. I think you will see and I think you will see the federal regulators, securities regulators, I don't want to touch anybody else, but I think that you will see them deliberately pull back in some areas and they're restrained anyway. The current judiciary mood doesn't give them a lot of leeway to pursue new regulations.
So it sounds like we're not going to get a federal money transmitter statute.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems, I mean, I know the CFPB actually is trying their hardest to sort of row in. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't like trying to figure out what, a Trump administration, I had to do this 8 years ago and it was awful then. Trying to figure out what they're going to do now is somewhat guesswork. But like, I think in a purest sense, the legislator is not, everyone, you all mind red wave, all three houses, but it's a Republican House by like 2 votes. And not enough votes in the Senate to push anything through. So you're still in like a deadlock situation that, I don't see a federal money transmitter coming through. I don't see federal crypto legislation coming through unless they can really, stablecoins is the easiest one. So if they could get their act together on stablecoins, you might be able to thread that needle through because there is some slightly more receptive nature to that. But the problem I think with, even with stablecoin, both sides overplay their hand constantly. So, like if they could get together and say, look, stablecoins, for better or worse, aren't going away, but they're pretty easy to regulate if we want to, there's some policy decisions about who's allowed to do them and how we oversee them, but not the hardest thing to really regulate. But, the pro-crypto side will then put a bunch of other stuff on it that is unacceptable. And then, the Warren wing will pour in like crazy AML requirements that are like, AML's useful, but like, bank secrecy needs to be tempered and individual liberty needs to be tempered. So I think it's hard in the current environment to see what happens. And I tweeted the other day, or skeeted, whatever we're calling it these days, that Brown losing in Ohio, though nominally to a crypto favorite, is actually probably bad for the future hopes of the crypto bill, because he was not as ideologically opposed and was willing, more so than Warren, to compromise and could have probably shepherded through the more skeptical votes you needed to get a stablecoin bill through. So I just think it's hard to see anything happening.
So we're recording this, maybe a week after Mark Andreessen of A16Z went on to Joe Rogan and complained about all of the debanking that has happened in crypto and how, I don't know, he was trying to pretend like he was championing the people and how hard it is for those getting debanked. I don't think he's mentioning that the people getting debanked are like multimillionaire venture capitalists and people spinning up whatever, whatever.
We all agree Mark Andreessen has the hardest life.
Yeah. Well, but my point here being, isn't that, I kind of feel like this is exactly what people like Mark Andreessen want. Like, what we're talking about right now, this stepping back of any federal regulation, and then this broken kind of weird system of state regulations that you never even know if what they take it to the Supreme Court and who knows what they're going to say about it, right? Like you start doing these, getting into this weird dynamic where it's like, I think that's what these guys actually do want, is just complete regulatory failure, I guess, would be the way I would term it. But maybe I'm too pessimistic. I don't know.
No, I'm a pretty cynical person, so I would tend to agree. I think if you look at that sort of the CFPB becoming all of a sudden like in between Elon and the Joe Rogan thing, you could look at it pretty cynically and say, like the fintech guy had a bunch of fintech dinged by the CFPB and one shut down. And Elon Musk wants X to get a money transmitter thing without having to have federal oversight. It's not like they're not playing 8-dimensional chess over there. They just, I think you're right. They just selfishly want to be able to, one of the things with fintech.
Elon's not even a fan of 2-dimensional chess.
Yeah. So, one of the things, you're right, that a lot of the last decade of fintech has been about getting as close to doing regulated financial services without being regulated as possible. And so they absolutely benefit from a world where gridlock reigns and nothing get pushed through because they continue to push through the cracks and allowed to do as much as they can without sort of oversight.
I think we've entered this period of time where regulators, and there's not to say there's no reason for this, but where regulators are looked at as inefficient, useless, that they're on the wrong side of a lot of these battles. And now people would rather trust these billionaires who are talking their book, and they'll be like, yeah, these regulators, I hate them. I hate these regulators. We should get rid of them. Whereas they don't understand that maybe like, I'm not a fan of the way that I like the idea of merging these two. I like the idea of enhancing it so that, okay, we merge these two and then we have clear restrictions on what's going to happen and who's allowed to play in these markets. And, you know, but I guess I fear now that because the popular side of this is actually what the billionaires want, that again, this cynical feeling of, oh, the people don't even realize that the regulators are supposed to be there for their benefit, that we've already gone past that. And now people are like, yeah, the regulators are there to hurt me personally. They're not even there to protect me.
Yeah. So I think that's probably true. So I would say that's particularly true from what I see online, sort of like from the broadest Gen Z stereotype, but sort of certainly from people who are more interested in crypto or Bitcoin or whatever. They certainly definitely feel the regulator is preventing them from making money. And they feel like, like that's what they see, the SEC's primary function is to prevent me from making money. And I think that's in that space. Certainly they look past, whatever merits the SEC has, and definitely see them as an inhibitor, and they're stopping me from getting mine. And I think that's certainly a dangerous place. And I think some of that's earned, some of that's unearned. But I think if you look at but I think when you need to look at sort of the feeling of the general industry and the participants, and then sort of the rich people and the people, the people who run the companies. I mean, I think they also sort of generally prefer the status quo for crypto regs in the US because there is none, and they can continue to sort of play in the gray area. Because if you look at, Europe passed crypto regulation a couple of years ago, came in live, it's MiCA, it's tremendously boring. And like, no one really likes it or hates it, but like crypto is a very different thing over here because they put in enough basic framework that you don't have the same drive. So I think a lot of it is very specific to the sort of culture in the US at the moment, and this sort of feeling. And, I don't want to dive too deep into pop psychology of sort of the system being rigged against you. And then, like, let's be honest, like the crypto industry lobbying industry was handed a gift with Gary Gensler becoming the SEC chief, because he is, even when he's right, he's unlikable. I mean, he's just not like, he is a very unlikable character and a perfect boogeyman for an industry. And so like, the simple fact that like who is the chair of the SEC raised itself to a talking point during a presidential election, something's gone wrong. Like if you're the chair of a securities regulator, like the average person should not know who you are. I mean, like it's really not a job that like people should know your name. Like they should just know the regulators doing stuff, but like you should not know who's in charge of it. And so I think that's sort of the whole, the ferment around it is really sort of personality driven, and they sort of found the perfect bad guy from their perspective, because like my background is far more TradFi, and like I can say the SEC, Gary Gensler's reign at the SEC was not loved by the TradFi side either. I mean, it was sort of like he was an equal opportunity antagonist when it comes to sort of TradFi and crypto.
What's kind of hilarious to me about that is there was a brief window when Gary Gensler was initially nominated where the cryptocurrency industry was excited about him because he had lectured on cryptocurrency and because he had shown some like openness and familiarity with the industry. And then they very quickly changed their tune.
Yeah. I mean, like I told a joke the other day, funny, that crypto industry was briefly very exciting because they said Gary got crypto, but also like Gary got crypto. So it's a real monkey paw situation. Like you want a securities regulator who understands crypto, like be careful of that, because it also means he understands it. So like, notwithstanding his approach to enforcement, I think I will say this, like I have had my issues with him. I think he was more right than wrong on crypto, but I think also, as I have been told at various points in my career, being right isn't a bulletproof vest. And so I think his approach made his life a lot more difficult than it needed to be.
Yeah, I think it's proven that at least under his reign, enforcing regulation has not worked. And that might just be because the arguments they made in courts were poorly done, or like I don't know why it hasn't appropriately worked. But like, I think the Ripple case was really a turning point, where it was like, oh wow, this has been incredibly ineffectual and inefficient, and wasted everyone's time and money.
Yeah, and you guys talked about it on your SEC episode, so I don't want to sort of rehash it. But I mean, he was, whatever my criticisms of Gary Gensler, he was also between a rock and a hard place, because the same industry that attacked him, and same politicians that attacked him for regulation by enforcement also attacked him for trying to regulate FTX, and then attacked him for not regulating FTX enough before it blew up. So, in a lot of ways, being a regulator is really thankless if you happen to be there when something goes spectacularly wrong, because you almost never can catch it before it really blows up. You just hope to catch it before it becomes a world-breaking event. So I don't think he was in a particularly winnable situation. Now, I think his approach and his political ambitions probably made it even less winnable. But I just think he was and I think the other thing to think about when he launched the SEC launched its real sort of crypto attack, it was in the crypto winter was happening. There were a lot of people, and I would say I was one of them, that said, look, this thing's going to burn out anyway. So he's going to come in with all these actions, mop up the mess. FTX is blown up. All these things are blowing up. It'll be gone anyway by the time he's done. And then obviously it's proved far more resilient than certainly I thought it was. And I think far more resilient than the policymakers thought it was. So then numbers started going up again, and all of a sudden he became the bad guy again.
I think there are places you can criticize Gary Gensler, but even a lot of his crypto-focused enforcement was reasonably successful. And even the cases that are still ongoing, most of the ones that are coming to my mind seem like justified by at least some amount of legitimate concern about rule breaking and things like that. There was never really a possibility of there being new crypto legislation coming through Congress in the last several years.
Yeah.
There's never been enough of a majority or a bipartisan coalition that was ever actually going to make that happen.
I will say that part of the issue part of the criticism for a lot of people is that he was going after, famous people doing NFT projects where you're like, yeah, good, great. Yeah. I'm not saying it's not a worthy case to go after, but it also feels like a super easy slam dunk. And as opposed to,
that's the thing. Well, and the thing is, if you don't go after those cases, right? If you don't go after Jake Paul or Logan Paul or whatever promoting Tron, that becomes permissible, right? You need to go after the people who are going to immediately settle, and in so doing, discourage everyone else from beginning that type of behavior.
I'm not arguing against that. I'm saying that if that's the only thing
but it's not, right? He went after the top crypto firms in the United States, Coinbase, Gemini, Circle. He went after Poloniex and Justin Sun.
So I think we've been talking about stable coins, the idea that there's no legislation and no actions taken against any of these coins, whether they've done spectacularly well or they've spectacularly failed. The idea that no one has ever come after them for anything or tried to be like, hey, here's even when Tether got in trouble, the amount of trouble that they got in was so minimal. And the deal that they made with New York was so easy to just be like, yeah, here's whatever the information you want, and we'll pay our $30 million fine or whatever it was and move on. The inability to do real legislation and ensure real regulation is occurring so that everyone knows what's going on, I think has been the real criticism, as opposed to I know he's gotten a few of these people for, I don't know, Gemini Earn or whatever. How many people use that, Bennett? You know what I mean?
I mean, very few, but that's kind of broadly a crypto adoption problem, the amount of money and attention that goes into crypto is still somewhat disconnected from the number of people who actually use crypto.
The celebrity thing, I mean, that is a standard playbook. You go after the most famous people because you hope to set an example. They did it with ICO. Clayton did it with ICOs. It's a pretty standard approach. I think, just there's so much money in a small number of people's hands that SEC doesn't have the right to fine people for $1 trillion. I mean, ultimately, there's sort of limits to how much they can do. And so I think the problem if there's to be, I think Bennett's point, like SEC has still won far more than they've lost on crypto cases under Gary Gensler. So I think it's, when you're in the social media sphere and it's very easy to get it's stupid. It's very easy to get sucked in that this is a bigger industry than it is. Like not, it's big and lots of people have lots of money, but it's not, it's relative to the larger financial industry. It's not that big. And it's, every time FCC has a setback in court, you hear about that ceaselessly for months. Whereas when, they win, it just sort of gets brushed aside. So I think we should say they've had more success than not. I think the challenge is the SEC never went the extra step when they could have and introduced sort of guidelines or regulation, sort of for the industry. Now, whether, Gensler, I believe, is sincere in his belief that the existing rules cover it, that they didn't need to do new rules, notwithstanding the crypto custody rule, which sort of contradicts that position. But so I just think it's sort of just been they've been in a weird place. They were led by probably not the best person to lead the crusade, because you need to get public opinion and policymakers on your side. And you can't sort of burn the boats on your way out. So, I mean, if you look at, and anyone familiar with Gensler's term, because I had to be, his term at the CFTC, I mean, it ended largely the same way. It didn't end with high fives on the way out the door. A lot of people, and especially international regulators, were very happy to see him no longer at the CFTC. So part of it is a sort of a singular management personality style.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, I think sometimes, especially in the crypto information bubble, there's certain people who accept as true the crypto industry's framing of Gensler's term. And I think there's a significant gap in certain places between reality and the cryptocurrency phrasing there, or cryptocurrency industry framing on it. Especially since biggest, most prominent loss I can come up with for the SEC when it comes to crypto is XRP, and that's a Clayton suit, right? Not a Gensler suit.
Yes. I mean, I think my biggest criticism of Gensler, it's not so much, like I said, I think he was mostly right. I think it was just his approach and knowing you were heading into a hostile judiciary and knowing that Chevron was going to get killed at some point. That was, the writing was on the wall, that at some point they were going to run out of road for agency discretion to not come up with some sort of guideline on how you could register a coin, for example. I think it's a fair criticism. It says you can register a coin as security, and then you go to them, you say, how do you do that? And they say, I don't know. I mean, that is a fair criticism. Regulation by enforcement, I don't think is a fair criticism. That's how regulation and enforcement both work. So I just think, and I'm also, I will say, as a sort of more TradFi person, I think, as I mentioned a little while ago, his tenure and on the TradFi side has been equally as poorly received. And I would say, as much as he was mostly right in crypto, he was mostly wrong on TradFi. And I think that is sort of a double whammy for a commissioner. So I think it just leaves us in a weird, we should be in a better place, because I think Bennett has a good point that a lot of his cases weren't bad on the face of it. You could argue, were certain coin securities, yes or no? I mean, that's a perfectly fine thing to argue, but I don't think it was as disastrous as it now seems, I guess.
Another thing that I forgot to say, though, is that the other flip side of this criticism is that FTX happened. That FTX was allowed to have an FTX US, that they were allowed to, SBF and others were allowed to get the ear of politicians, that they were allowed to have meetings with the SEC. That I hear the idea of why wouldn't they? But
But we need to be clear that the critics of the SEC would never permit an SEC that would have been taking aggressive action against FTX in July of 2022.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, they sent a letter.
That's true.
There were politicians that sent a letter, said back off FTX. Somehow that's been memory old. So
and those same politicians come November 15th or whatever, a couple days after they declared bankruptcy, sent another letter saying, oh, you were meeting with this guy but didn't sue him? Are you in on this, Gary Gensler?
Right.
There was no enforcement that the cryptocurrency industry was going to accept from Gary Gensler. A single case was too many cases for them.
Yeah, sure, I agree. I think that there is it's similar to the I think the anger people felt after Enron or after Bernie, right? Where like, I mean, Bernie is the best example, probably, where the SEC literally investigated him multiple times and was like, oh, everything's fine, I guess. Where you're just like, what are you guys doing? And I think that if you want a regulator to behave like a regulator and actually stop fraud, then that is a valid criticism. Like, yeah, you should have been looking into FTX and this American and his weird arbitrage practices, and you should have been looking at that for sure. But like, alternatively, you're right. The crypto industry, anyone in the cryptocurrency industry saying, yeah, why didn't he catch FTX is blowing smoke up your ass because they wouldn't have wanted him to anyway. So that's fair. But I think anyone who wants good regulation, that's a valid criticism, because it's like, why didn't you catch something like that? Like, why not? You know?
Yeah,
what are you guys doing?
I don't want to go too far down the FTX rabbit hole, but I will just say that FTX US still hasn't really been charged with anything, which I find mind-blowing. Like, I don't understand how FTX Bermuda is obviously criminal, but FTX US has no members of FTX US have ever faced any serious charges, are as far as I know. But I think part of it, I think your point about, you did see the same anger at the SEC when that blew up. Like, when big frauds happen, the regulators always get in the neck because everything always looks better in hindsight. I mean, everything looks obvious in hindsight. So in hindsight, of course, this was criminal. The Madoff's facts, the SEC did investigate, but didn't actually bother to check the DTC codes, so there are some like really simple oversights. But I think if you go to bring it sort of full circle-ish, and we can bring this FTX into the CFTC SEC part, like, you got to remember, like, the CFTC was within like a hair's breadth of approving SPF self-clearing for FTX, which would have been a major shift in policy, because a lot of the frictions we have in the financial infrastructure are there intentionally. There's a sort of fire break, so you can't, do fraud as easily. And, that was dangerously close to being pushed through because the CFTC was easier to lobby than the SEC at the time. And this was back to where we, opened up here. One of the reasons having a single market securities market regulator would make that sort of regulatory arbitrage a lot harder to pull off. And I think that's really ultimately the case. It's still the case. The merger still exists. And, we can look at the FTX thing and say, how does CFTC and SEC be more aligned? I'm not sure they would have caught it quicker, but, SPF might not have been as pervasive and persuasive in his sort of lobbying efforts with the CFTC.
That's a great way to round that out. Sean, thank you for joining us. That was a fun conversation. And I'm looking forward to no more regulation anymore. It's going to be great.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a good time. It's fun, so it's, you interact with people online in text-based format forever. It's nice to finally see and talk to people. So thanks for having me.